Okay, so, right. Okay, so this week we've got one that we had originally, A Winner Is You, had originally planned to podcast about, but as of the time of recording, it's starting to look a bit like the podcast is not going to happen. So if you're hearing this, then the podcast didn't happen, and I'm going to use the fact that I played through this game for something else. If you don't hear this, then you'll never know about it, but go and check out the podcast. Either way, I guess. So what are we playing today? It has been called, or is called, Onimusha Warlords, and it came out on the PlayStation 2. The sort of elevator pitch for this game is to think of it as Resident Evil, but for samurai warriors. Sorry if you can hear some rummaging about. I've been sitting here waiting for about 5 minutes for the dogs to stop moving after their walk, to think, right, they'll calm down and go away and stop making a noise, but I can still see them rummaging about after I thought the younger one had stopped moving. But anyway, yes, elevator pitch is Resident Evil, but for samurai warriors. So this is set in what appears to be feudal Japan. You take on the role of a samurai warrior as he goes in search for, I think is his sister, to try and rescue her from where she lives seems to have been overtaken by some sort of demon. And then you go on a mission through this game trying to basically stop the demon in its tracks and prevent it from, I don't know, taking over the world, I suppose, eventually would be its aim. But for the most part, or the moment, you're really taking back the sort of area that he has overtaken, yeah. The good thing about this game, despite its age, or I don't know, good or bad thing, I thought that this was a universally held opinion, but having been playing a lot of Resident Evil games recently, it has become obvious that there's quite a significant part or group of people that enjoy the tank controls, which is absolutely fine. I've listened to and heard their reasons for it, and I do understand it, even if I don't quite agree myself. So where I was going with that is, the thing about this is that it for the age of the game, it still controls and feels like a relatively new game. There's no tank controls. You can there's analog movement, I guess, is what I'm getting at with this game. And you sort of I'm trying to think of the main gameplay loop. Yes, you run around and you can hack up people with your swords. You've also got a couple magic attacks, strength attacks, and what you do is you have a bunch of different swords that do different things. So like you have, well, they don't do different things, they're all swords, but essentially you've got things like you've got a fire sword that moves quite slowly when you swing it, whereas you've got a more, I think it's an electric powered sword that you can move around quite quickly. So depending on your play style, you'll be wanting to make sure you're using the right swords. The sort of wrinkle to that being that each sword has its magic attack, so you'll be wanting, and each magic attack is different, and that goes from being like bolts of lightning coming down to flame attacks to whirlwind attacks and things like that, and they're both useful in different scenarios. So like the whirlwind attack is good for taking out a lot of enemies if you're being surrounded, whereas like the fire magic attack with the different sword is good for doing strong hits or doing a lot of damage in one area to one specific enemy. And you want to, the game is designed pretty well in the way that you'll be constantly changing the types of swords you're using, and as you kill enemies, you can absorb their souls, which you can then spend as the game progresses on upgrades. And this is also how the game gates progress. So there will be areas of the game that have a door that you can't open unless you've got the fire sword to level 2 or the electric sword to level 1, and that's how the game will stop you from progressing or sort of curb your progress till you've gone and done other things. It's interesting. I'm trying to think of other games that I've played that do that, in terms of they'll get your progress by leveling up specific weapons, and I'm sure they do it, but I'm just struggling to sort of pull it out my backside and come up with them off the top of my head. This is a surprisingly fun, engaging game. It definitely is a shorter game. I think it's only 5 to 6 hours long. It should take you to complete, and I think that's long enough. I think if it stayed any longer, then the game would start to become quite long in the tooth. By the time it finished, I was ready for it to be finished. I think that's a combination of, I mean, the story's not great, but it's fun and it does enough to sort of propel you through the game. I'm trying to think, like, Resident Evil has... I'm going to constantly relate these to Resident Evil games because that's ostensibly what it is. Resident Evil games have a huge lore, and a lot of it's very silly, but at the same time it's still quite interesting. This has the silliness, I would say, but perhaps the silliness is a bit through schlockiness rather than being deliberately funny, which I think the longer I play Resident Evil games, the more I think it's trying to be deliberately funny. So like I say, it's 6 hours, and I think that's long enough, even slightly too long, I would say, by about an hour, but I'm not going to quibble about this. It's a short game, and yeah, the reason that I think it's good is because the gameplay loop is fairly simple. Like I was going to say, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, but where I'm going with this is the gameplay loop is fairly simple. You've got your different swords types. You'll pick your favourite sword type and you'll use it unless you're having to use the magic attacks, or at least I found, at which point you will then switch your magic over, use the magic attack, and then use your sword to then absorb souls that will give you X. So this is another wrinkle that actually now I'm talking about this game. It's been a little while since I played it, and like I say, I got a feeling that this podcast might not happen, and I was keen not to waste this because it's a game that's worth talking about. When you kill an enemy, it leaves its souls behind, and as I said before, you can use those souls to upgrade your guns. I'm going to say that often. Apologies. Upgrade your swords. Now, you get 3 different types of souls. You get, I think they're yellow, red, and white. I think like that. That's the way it goes. The yellow ones, when you absorb them, they increase your health or replenish your health, should I say. The red ones, I think those are the ones that would allow you to upgrade your weapons, and then there's the other one which will allow you to improve your magic or increase your magic that you have with that sword. So what happens is, say if you fully max out the magic that you've got with a sword, what will happen then is you will then have roughly 3 magic attacks, I think, by the end of the game, before then it's depleted and you have to round up souls to replenish. The game's good enough for the most part in that there are always enemies. I didn't feel that I had to do too much grinding. I felt that for the most part I generally had enough souls to upgrade what I wanted. There was one occasion in which I leveled up a sword, the wrong one, and I had to go back and do a little bit of grinding, but it wasn't too tiresome. It was quite fun, and each enemy type has an interesting maneuverability in that there are certain ways that make it easier to take down different enemies. Meaning that it was quite fun to try and learn how best to approach each enemy. The other thing that I think is worth of note with this game is it's got a very rudimentary parry system, which is extremely interesting. Again, this is probably something that's been around in games for a while that I'm just not picking up on or haven't picked up on, and it's just that I'm going back now and playing these games with Alex that I'm really realising it. But I wonder if this is sort of where the From Software Souls games got this from, because it is very, very similar. And I'd say probably, and again, I'm no expert with these Souls games, but the parry system has become more doable as these games have went on. In the first sort of Demon Souls, early Souls games were quite difficult to parry, and it was a real sort of frame level skill that you had to hone. This one's very much like that, and a lot of the time I was pulling off parries by accident, really. But I can see how if you got really good at this game, the parry system would be extremely rewarding and extremely fun to use, and it make you look a real badass. The other thing that this game's got that I thought was really good fun is it's got what do you call it? It's like a dungeon run mode in which you start off at the top and you've basically got to try and get to the bottom of the dungeon, at which point you'll unlock what appears to be the best sword in the game. This is so simple because the area that you're fighting in is super narrow, and actually by the end of the game I kind of realised that the enemy variation types were quite small as well. But this is a really, really fun section of the game, and if we're talking about edge of your seat, like clenched moments, this game was full of them, and it was a real, really good experience. I feel like, again, this is probably the length of time that it's been since I played this game, that I don't have a huge amount to say about it, but really all you need to know is it's got fairly modern feeling movements in controller for the game's age. And imagine it like a Resident Evil, but set in feudal Japan. And you really aren't far away. This is a fun game that is a short experience, as I say, rightly so, but it's one that I think any Resident Evil fan worth their salt really needs to go away and experience, because it's from that ilk and really, really worth your time. So I guess that's our 10 minutes up, so that kind of brings me to the end of this one. Thanks for listening if you made it through that terrible garbled nonsense. If you want to check out what I'm doing, follow me on Twitter, which is @DavidSmiley1, with all my links and stuff will be at the bottom. You can also check out my podcast, which is the Winner Issue Podcast, which I do alongside Mr. Alex Aldridge. And I suppose with that, thanks for watching, guys. See you later.